Hello and welcome. In this video, we will introduce you to the critique, a way to bring theory, philosophy, and activism into debate. In this video, we'll talk first about what is a critique. Second, we'll break it down into the different components. Third, we'll talk about how to use a critique in a debate. And lastly, we'll talk about how to answer them as the affirmative. First, so what are we talking about? The critique, or K, is German for criticism. This is an advanced form of argumentation primarily used by the negative. This term is frankly an umbrella that refers to a wide range of arguments covering language and etymology, ethics, sociopolitical structures, and identity. Critiques are hard to write, complex to argue, and difficult to answer, so make sure you have the fundamentals down before trying to use one yourself. As with any negative argument, strategic choices made about the critique should be done by the second negative speaker, the quarterback for the negative, who determines the negative strategy in the block and will have to eventually go for that argument in the second negative rebuttal. A few considerations about critiques. The first is time. Critiques are large, complex, and take a long time to read compared to other arguments. Therefore, if you're reading one in the first negative constructive, be sure that it's something you can actually win the round on, because you won't have as much time to read other arguments later. The second is tactics. Critiques are attacking the affirmative and also offering an alternative to the world of the plan. It's best to spend an entire speech in the block, if not both, discussing the critique to make sure you address all aspects. So, how do you build a critique? Critiques are made up of familiar building blocks. If you stay focused on these building blocks, it's the best way to make the critique manageable and less intimidating. The first building block you should be familiar with is a link, connecting the affirmative plan and the rest of the argument, usually a question of cause and effect. Critique links are often broader than the links for, say, a disadvantage, but they still show how the plan is a problematic action. A link for a critique could say, for example, that the plan makes an assumption that is problematic. For example, if the plan increases trade, the assumption is that capitalism is good. The plan could use language or imagery that is offensive, sexist, for example. And the plan could make a value judgment, such as human lives are worth more than animal lives, that you find problematic. In the WUDL core files, we have included a critique of capitalism, arguing that capitalism is bad, in the Junior Varsity packet, and a biopower critique, arguing that the expansion of government power over individuals is oppressive, in the Varsity packet. The second component to a critique is the impact. This is a discussion of what the negative outcome is of the plan. This should focus on three fundamental areas that should be familiar to you: the magnitude, which is how big and how bad the negative outcome is; the time frame, when will it happen; and the probability, how likely is this big bad outcome to happen. For critiques, they are often systemic, discussing issues such as racism, dehumanization, or structural violence. But they can also be more specific, such as war, climate change, or famine. Let's talk a little more in depth about arguing the impacts of a critique. Strong critiques attack the case on three levels. We'll use a critique of capitalism to demonstrate. First, critiques have an external impact. The affirmative is bad for a reason directly comparable with the affirmative. Capitalism causes environmental destruction, so if the plan causes a war, you can directly compare these two impacts. Secondly, strong critiques attack the solvency of the affirmative. Whatever the affirmative does wrong, the link prevents them from solving the case, so they can't actually weigh their advantages against yours. Here's an example. Demands of the global elite for more wealth and commerce make the plan fail, because we can't trust the affirmative's evidence. Their authors are paid to support the global trade regime financed by elites. Lastly, you should always make a turns case argument. The impact of a critique turning the case makes any impacts of the affirmative inevitable or worse instead of better. For example, if the gains made from trading clean technology are buried by the growth of manufacturing, then the case isn't actually net beneficial. the last piece of a critique is the alternative. Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. You can't just complain and offer a critique of the affirmative's assumptions without offering some sort of a solution. Alternatives can specifically reject the affirmative if their links are really specific to the 1AC. Secondly, they should have solvency, just like a counterplan. Third, they should be able to solve some or all of the affirmative impacts. Third, they have specific texts that the negative will be held to defend throughout the debate, just like a counterplan. And lastly, they must also, like a counterplan, be mutually exclusive to the affirmative. If you can do the affirmative and the alternative, you're critiquing modern society, not the plan. Lastly, let's talk about framework. Some critiques object to the affirmative on ethical or moral grounds, and they offer a competing decision-making framework to the values expressed by the affirmative. For example, if the affirmative values whether folks live or die, but the critique suggests that we should act morally no matter what the cost, the judge will need to choose a value system, death or morals, before deciding whether the affirmative team wins or loses. Winning framework is necessary to win the critique. If the negative loses framework, that death comes before morals, there isn't really a reason to vote against the affirmative if reducing morality is the only impact. Let's talk about how to debate the critique. In the 1NC, writing a critique can be challenging. Remember to keep it short. Evidence for critiques is based in philosophy and theory. Their wording is often dense and the cards are long, so be sure do anything you can to keep it short and sweet. Make sure to include the basics, a link to the affirmative plan, an impact or evidence that refers to several, and an alternative that clearly states what your alternative is, even if it doesn't go very deep into how the alternative solves. Third, make sure you explain things. Don't use jargon or any other specific terminology and assume the judge knows what you're talking about. Like all arguments, you should develop a critique in the block, adding more evidence and further explaining the narrative of the critique. At the top, tell a story. What is the thesis of your criticism? First, let's talk about the link debate. It's important to answer anything coming out of the 2AC about the link debate. Next, draw specific links from the affirmative evidence, words, or actions. The more specific you can describe why the specific case is bad, the better. Unless the link is obvious or conceded, reading a bunch of additional links, often called a link wall, is quite important. Lastly, on the link debate, answer permutations. These are do-both arguments that can be very dangerous. If you have a strong link, doing both should be impossible. Next, you'll want to extend the impact debate, answer any 2AC arguments, and explain how the critical impacts interact with the affirmative, doing impact calculus. Lastly, be sure to extend your alternative. Explain it in your own words, give real-world examples, and answer any arguments from the 2AC made against it. If you're going to go for a critique in the second negative rebuttal, don't talk about anything else. Win this argument and win the debate. As always, tell a brief story. What is the narrative of your critique? Second, explain why you can't do both. If the affirmative makes this argument in the 1AR, this is the most dangerous argument they make. Next, make sure to answer the link and impact and alternative arguments from the 1AR. Lastly, explain the alternative in words the judge can understand. What does it do and how does it work? Finally, do some impact calculus. Why does the critique outweigh and/or turn the case? Critiques are often debated so poorly and give judges headaches. They are often won because one team knows what the critique says and the other doesn't. Don't let that be you. Stay focused on the building blocks. After the 1NC, refer to a specific part of the debate when you make an argument, on the link, on the impact, etc. Lastly, do impact calculus versus the affirmative and explain how they can't access their impacts because of your critique's attack on their solvency. Doing this in-depth analysis about the different pieces of evidence in the round makes you look really smart and will give you tons of speaker points. Answering the critique shouldn't be daunting as long as you spend the time and questioning to figure out what the hell the negative is actually talking about. First, let's talk about the link debate. No link arguments are always helpful. Is their link specific to your affirmative, or is it just to the topic in general? Is the affirmative the problem? Are they a passive participant in a larger system? Or are they simply guilty for not having talked about a certain issue? Make the negative establish a brink or timeline about how much of the problem needs to exist before the impact happens. Does your affirmative push the system over the edge? Make sure your case doesn't come near that brink. As always, it's important to consider some offense. The link turn is a viable opportunity to really go after the critique. If the affirmative actually reduces the harms the negative identifies instead of causing them, you've already defeated the critique. But remember, don't double turn yourself. You can't link and impact turn the critique at the same time. On the impact debate, first of all and foremost, remember that your first affirmative constructive, your advantages are still relevant. Any impact that's in the 1AC should be compared to those of the critique. Secondly, to debate the impacts of the critique like you would any other argument. Attack the likelihood they will happen, the magnitude of the impact, and the time frame in which they will occur. For example, if the negative says that capitalism is bad, argue that it is not a no-impact argument, and then go on the offensive and defend your affirmative and its assumptions by saying things like capitalism is good. Impact turns are often an underrated way to attack a critique. If the critique reads a framework, be sure to win this framework so your impacts count. The permutation is also a powerful weapon against the critique, and often their Achilles heel. Any answer should start with a permutation, suggesting that the affirmative and the negative can coexist. Like on a counterplan, the critique must be mutually exclusive with the affirmative. If you can do both, the negative is just complaining about modern society, and it is not presenting reasons to reject the affirmative. Lastly, let's talk about the alternative. First, make sure you understand it. Ask questions about it in cross-examination, such as, what would life be like in the world of the critique, and how do we get there? The negative will often be vague or hide their true intent. For example, if the critique rejects the government, they may not say the result is anarchy, but that's probably what they're going for. If the alternative advocates a disengagement with the government, that is in itself a political act. Surrendering governance and power to your political opponents usually has a bad outcome. Many alternatives are often too vague or too weak to act upon. Sometimes they're even too utopian or unrealistically good. You can attack these alternatives on theoretical grounds. You could argue that explaining how risky it is to vote for a vague or undeveloped idea, or you can object that it's unfair that you have to debate a perfect world. Remember, alternatives need solvency just like the affirmative. When debating the critique, you have to win the framework or the role of the ballot. This is a decision-making system in which your affirmative still has the possibility of being a good idea. Often, you may also have to defend that you should engage in policy action. Like topicality, explain that your system, engaging in policy and the specifics of your 1AC, is better by focusing on these two concepts, education and fairness. First, let's hit on education. If the affirmative has to defend all possible assumptions instead of just potential policy improvements, it discourages topic research, reduces clash, could reduce critical thinking, and make debate less relevant by focusing on philosophy instead of action. In terms of fairness, there are a limitless number of potential critiques, which is unpredictable, hard to research, and distracting from the key educational value of the topic. Both sides enter the round with common expectations of what the rules are, like how long each person will speak and what they will speak about. If the negative talks about a critique, they are straying from this core agreement of what the round will be about. Lastly, make sure their advocacy is a good idea in the debate space. Some arguments can be good politics, good activism, and good intellectually, but if they can't be contested or if they won't have a persuasive impact in the competitive space of a debate round, there's no point in having them there.